Woo.
So first off, before I start talking about stuff I'm particularly interested in, I want to say thank you all very much for coming to the little shindig I put on. I want to make some particular things while I'm at it. The ASUC gave me about $1,000 to do this and waived the fee for the reserve, and that's very generous of them. But I also have to specifically thank a bunch of you for donating, and for that matter, a bunch of you people who are watching this who aren't here right now also donated money, which is really kind of amazing to me. So by name, Kelly Drinkwater, Douglas Narad, Richard Brody, Doug Ball, Sarah Higley, Glenn Kemp and Tony Harris, neither of whom are here, Matt Pearson, Bill Weldon, and a couple of people who prefer to remain anonymous. Thank you very much. Quite honestly, I wouldn't have been able to do this without you guys, because stuff costs money. That's one of the things. Also, I did get last-minute support from the Cognitive Science Department, or more accurately put, the professor thereof. So I'd like to thank him very much. He funded Sally Case for coming here, which is quite nice. Secondly, everybody, all you guys who've got a yellow dot, thanks for helping out and volunteering. I can only be in one place at one time as yet of my meditation practice. And it's very, very helpful. Thank you very much. Ellen Wright, I have to thank, who's probably done the most behind the scenes stuff to help me out. She made the website, she made all the design stuff on the t-shirts and the program. She did half of the content on it, etc. And has been very helpful. And there's been a bunch more people who've been helpful, whom I've listed in the program. And thank you to everyone. And of course, thank you to the other speakers who have so far been excellent. And I hope that at least the other speakers will be also equally worthy to listen to. Before I introduce the next guy who's talking, I'd like to make one sort of pragmatic point. At this point, I have no idea where I'm going to be next year. And as of yet, I don't know anyone at Berkeley who's willing to take this over from me. If there is someone, please let me know. I've set this all up for you. All you've got to do is ask for more money, and they will give it to you. And you can basically copy everything I did, and it'd be cool. But failing that, if any of you guys, or any of you guys watching this, want to make the next one, please tell me. All of the profits from this conference, of which there's going to be probably a couple hundred, anywhere from 100 to 500, I won't know until the very final stuff is done, because that's about the amount of buffer that you need to run this. That all is going to go to the next conference to help fund it. I'll do whatever I can to help give any advice that my running of this may or may not be worth. Put you in contact, let you use my mailing list, etc., etc. I mean, please, we've got to continue this, seriously. I call this the first language creation conference for a reason. It's the first, but it should not be the last, and I won't let it be. One way or another. So, come on, you know who you are. You guys who've got university connections, I know you guys can swing a little bit of funding. Maybe some space for the conference. A lot of you are way better known than me, and way more professional and all that, and I'm sure you could even get people to help you. So let me know, please. So yeah, the next guy. I don't really know what to say about myself. I'm hoping that it's not just an act of hubris for me to have accepted my own paper, as it were. For what it's worth, the basic background, I'm a student here at Berkeley. I'm an undergraduate, senior. I will be getting my bachelor's in cognitive science, hopefully, next month. And I've been conlanging for a few years now. I started the live journal Conlangs community somewhere around 2000 or so. And this was before I discovered Conlang. So I didn't have a community that I knew of, and I didn't know ZBB at the time. So I wanted to start one, and I was on live journal, so that's what I made. What I'm particularly interested in is a meta approach to conlanging. I certainly respect all of the work that you guys do in developing artistic language, logical language, etc. My personal interest is in trying to push the boundaries of language in ways that haven't been done before in a serious sense. Not just recombining elements that have already existed, or coming up with a different way to do the same thing, or a different way to say the same thing, which are all perfectly good causes, and I certainly appreciate them as art. It's just not what I do. Which is why you won't see a language to my name on the program, because I don't have one. Years ago, I got stuck on this thing of trying to figure out what in the hell I wanted from my language, and I've been stuck on that ever since. So this is one of the ideas I've come up with. This is an offshoot of something I was doing in high school where I wanted to create a quote-unquote ideal language. And I wrote an essay about this on the design of an ideal language, which is online. If you Google it, you'll find it. Which I still stand by, although I will say it is a question of the design of my ideal language, or of a description of what I would consider an ideal language. There are many implementations that would fit in the description. This is basically just a list of my desiderata. One of them is to use language in a really efficient way, and to sort of make the most of your medium. So what I've been thinking of in the last couple of years is how to do this in writing, and specifically a non-linear writing system, quote unquote. Before I get into that, I want to make a few slight disclaimers. First off, my talk is in a somewhat different format than other people's. I'm weird. I'm basically talking from a sort of a list of bullet points, but it's essentially extemporaneous. This is just how I always do it, and I prefer to have things as a conversation than just as a lecture. So if at any point you have a question, or if you'd like me to elaborate on something, interrupt me and ask. Seriously. Until I finish my classes. Secondly, I'm just trying to present an idea here. I'm not a descriptive linguist, really. And this doesn't, that I've seen, really exist yet. And so for that reason, it's not completely fleshed out. And it's not as detailed as I would like it to be. Maybe 3 years down the line it will be. But so far I'm just trying to present an idea. That isn't really language specific. This is a meta thing. There are many, many possible implementations of what I'm talking about. And I'm not particularly concerned with exactly how it works, just the general idea. So this is a challenge of sorts. I want you guys to think about it. Maybe it'll challenge you, especially those of you who make conscripts or different writing systems or etc., to go out and make something like this. I would be really pleased. And send me a link. The examples I'm going to give are pretty trivial in some ways. They're just meant as ways to show a very small point. Please don't take them as like a final version by any stretch. And for that matter, my artistic skills are somewhat lacking. So I'm going to try drawing a few things that probably are going to look pretty ugly. but hopefully they get the point across. Although I'm sort of hemorrhaging into time right now, I'm going to try to be pretty terse, and I realize that I'm going to cover a lot of points that I'm not really going to elaborate on, because my idea here is to stimulate the imagination, not necessarily to fill in all the details for you. There's no handout, alas. If you want, you can look up the draft of the paper that I'm writing on this online. It's called Nonlinear Fully Two-Dimensional Writing System Design, a manifesto. It's on my LiveJournal and elsewhere. Is
something supposed to show up?
Sorry? No, this is just for me. We probably wouldn't have seen this. And I try to go into a little bit more detail there, but this is basically a summarized version of it. A couple last points. This has been a somewhat discussion-generating issue on Conlang. And I'm going to try to avoid the things that evoke flames. And let me say that I'm only trying to describe my personal concept of how this works. And for that purpose, I use the term nonlinear fully two-dimensional writing system, or NLF2DWS, or how about just this for the purpose of this talk? Just because I haven't thought of something clever to call it. Okay, awesome. That's just the name I'm going to use for it, so I encourage the people who are doing variants to call theirs different things so we know what we're talking about. So let me start. The first obvious question is, what the hell do you mean by nonlinear? And the first way to answer that is to say what I don't mean. I don't mean Korean, where it structures things in a sort of compacted manner. I don't mean nonlinear in the term that Wikipedia defines it, meaning not written in one continuous line of a pen. I don't mean sentence structure diagrams or transcriptions of things like ASL where you've got a few things going on simultaneously. Yeah, not really. What I do mean is a sort of a multi-graph, as it were, to use a CS-ish term, where you've got a bunch of things that are all interconnected. And as a result of that, if you can imagine it, what you would have is a pretty thank you. A pretty flexible traversal way. So let's just give sort of a very simplistic example. This would be like a pretty simple nodes and connections structure. There's no way to automatically linearize this, because you could have a bunch of different ways. You can start from any point, you can end at any point, you can recurse, you've got the traveling salesman problem for that matter as a subset of this. And that's one of the things that's going to be a little bit weird, and that's hard to wrap your head around, in that the language that we're familiar with, not just the writing systems are linear in that you can transform them into a string of symbols. This is true of every single writing system that I've seen, except for a couple that I'm going to mention. But you can just write them as like an arbitrary set of symbols, and you don't really lose anything except for maybe artistry, which is important and all that, but you don't syntactically lose anything. Whereas if you linearize that, you would. You could redo that as an array, as it were. But you would lose something pretty critical, and it wouldn't be nearly as intuitive for certain purposes.
Sorry,
yes.
You said you wanted a conversation and
please
interrupt you if possible. Can I add something after the get-go, so that we may maybe have a common understanding of what you're representing?
Certainly.
Are we to be focusing on that in terms solely of the nodal interconnections, or is the actual physical form, such as the entire shape,
Oh, I see.
also to be construed as presenting meaning and you know.
Ultimately both. In this example, I'm only trying to show the interconnections. But yes, the overall form, and I'll get to that, would also, in a more advanced implementation, would be critical. But that gets a little bit tricky. There's sort of two other things that are pretty defining about it. One is that any two symbols, if you've got that, and I'll explain that in a second, can be interconnected. And you can have many-to-many connections. Like the one on the left is connected to 3 things, and the one in the middle is connected to 3 things. And any of them could be connected to any of them. And you do get some issues that I'll address later of circuit over collisions and crossings and things like that, and etc. But those can be addressed. And the second thing is that the nonlinearity of this is pretty diffusive. It's not just writing in this sense, but if you think about it, how you would create a speech act would be very different. And this is, actually I was going to talk about this later, but I think it's better to mention it here. One of the things that's really obvious about anything, like if you open up a program, you'll see that it's structured in a very linear way. You've got one idea, and then you've got another idea, and then you've got another idea, and the author wants you to peruse them in that order. Whereas if you had a nonlinear system, you wouldn't have that control over the reader. And that basically does away with a few things. So you can object and say, well, I like my linearity, damn it. For a few common reasons. For one, time is linear, and I don't argue that. I'm not God, I'm not outside of time. So if you're going to be transcribing anything that actually occurs in time, like a speech act, like a literal speech act, that is definitely temporal. And if you were going to transcribe speech or a spoken name or a written name for any natural language, that would have to be linear. Another thing that's more interesting is that stories and jokes and means of instruction are linear, because you want to set someone up with the background before you can give them a punchline. This is why you can spoil a story for someone by giving it out of order. Part of the appreciation of a really good novel is the way in which it's structured, that you appreciate the sequence of events, and it builds tension, and release, and all that. And you wouldn't be able to do that in this. What you would be able to do is have an idea of a sort of gestalt perception of how the whole fits together, which would replace it. So as you explore the tree, or explore the graph, or whatever you want to call it, the writing, you'd gradually get an idea of how it all fits together, and you'd see patterns within it. And that is my conception of how a poem would work. It'd be a sort of appreciation of that. Yes?
If you don't have some kind of a predictable linear pathway for that your eyes know, how to traverse,
Sure.
then wouldn't you run the risk of overlooking something, missing something?
Yes, you would. And I think that is an acceptable risk in certain senses, in that suppose you're looking at this room and you're just looking over it, you will miss things. And in that sense, you could conceive of this sort of a writing as being a field to look at, a scene, if you will. And you can focus on different bits of it, especially if you have something I can call zoom, which is if for example, this thing right here turns out not to just be like some one thing, but it turns out to be like whatever this is, all interconnected, blah, 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 out, 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 and it just looks like that when you zoom out. When you zoom in, you see more detail, and it's actually sort of fractal in that sense. And you could you could sort of explore the detail as you wanted. And if you were to zoom all the way out, you'd see sort of the whole story, as it were, if you can zoom that far out. And if you zoom in more, you see the details of particular connections, particular stories within it, details of it, etc. Do you have a question?
You used the word poem,
Poem, yeah.
and I was thinking that a text of this sort would be very good for a contemplative piece
Yes.
instead of a narrative.
Yes, very much so.
Because a friend of mine talked about contemplative reasoning as opposed to argumentative reasoning. And that's what immediately came to mind when I.
Yes, exactly. And the
It's like hypertextual in a way that a concept.
yeah, the poem, this sort of the idea of the art that it would engender in me is a sort of Zen thing of appreciating the gestalt of, like getting at something.
It really lends
Not
itself to represent
of a narrative,
Yes.
really. And that's one of those pro and con things of what a trade-off here is. It's not going to do narrative very well. Okay, that's fine. I admit it right off the bat.
Maybe that might not even be a
That's okay.
function of it.
It might be. I mean, you could represent narrative in the sense, especially if you have cyclical patterns. Like if you're going to represent, say, a Greek tragedy, and you want to represent that circularity of causality, in a sense. Or if you've got a different con culture where you've got that sort of circular time thing that John mentioned earlier, then that would do really well for that. But if you really are relying on A followed B followed C, it's not really going to work. And that's an acceptable loss. And related to that is that it's not going to do very well if it's really strongly tied to a spoken language. This would only really do well if it's intended almost overridingly as a written exclusive language. But you could, of course, have ways to describe it in sound. You could have sort of standard ways of traversing, or lacking that, you could have ways of describing, of speaking it. And one example I'd like to give is, for example, I have no idea how to pronounce it, so I'm probably going to mangle it, my apologies, is a language called Owiyaru, O-W-I-Y-A-R-U, which is actually very, very similar to the concept that I'm talking about, and it does actually start with a way to speak it. And I think he actually does it quite nicely. But it's not going to be as good, and that's going to be an inherent trade-off. The more you make it speakable, the less powerfully you're going to really be using the full two dimensions of your writing surface. Another related thing to that is you're not really going to have paragraphs or like small chunks. It's not going to fit well onto a page, and then you turn the page and you've got another, paragraph of it. It's not really going to work like that. So you either need to be able to see it all at once, like it's a huge ass mural, or it fits on a page, or you need or you can like chop it up into discrete units, and I'm sure we can all think of ways you can do that, but it'd be kind of kludgy. And a more optimal way would be to have some sort of zoomable, pannable writing surface. And now that we're in computers, we don't have to stick to papyri, or stone or whatnot that are fixed, and you can only write it once, and that's it. But we can take advantage of mediums, like you were talking about in your first talk. And for that matter, it's going to be a little bit difficult to edit, and specifically to insert or delete things in a tree of any complexity. It's going to be pretty interconnected, and just finding the physical space to put something in is probably going to require a computer. And I acknowledge that. And related to that is that this is intended to be optimized not so much for writing, although that too, as for reading, as for comprehension. And I realize that it may take longer to write in this system than it would take to write an identical thing in a linear system. Even barring the question of fluency, which of course, is huge. But the idea is to have it easily perceptible. So one thing I can compare it to is flowcharts on crack. So I'm sure you're all familiar with flowcharts. You know, your standard business thing, you've got X goes to Y, and if then, you've got a little triangle, and little concave, whatever, etc. And those are nice, and for what it's worth, those are really intuitive ways to view a process. I think we can all agree that if we see a circuit diagram or a flowchart of some process, they're a lot more intuitive than reading the linear text description of the exact same thing. It's just a lot faster. You can see exactly what's going on. You can see cycles, etc., etc. The way this differs is that it's not that simple. So there's two ways I can see this working. One is what I would call the node and connection paradigm, which is sort of what I vaguely sketched there. In that you've got connections like you have in flowcharts of causality, right? But you could have a lot of other kinds of connections, like copular ones. I don't know how many of you have the Conlanging Bible describing morphosyntax by Thomas Paine. He describes a few different kinds: equation, attribution, subset, location, possession, and the unary existence copula. These are expressed in verbs in natural languages, but they need not be. All they're really describing is relations between two entities. And for that purpose, you can basically have a bunch of different, in the simplest form, you have a bunch of different lines. So like, if I wanted to make a kludgy version, I can do it by like making some symbol on that and some other symbol on that and a little box here or whatever. That's the simplest version. I'm sure you people who actually do decently artistic stuff can come up with much better ways of doing that. But it just shows what I mean. You've got conceptual connections, like causation in flowcharts, but also, for example, connecting your theory to your data. Like if you're presenting a paper trying to describe some theory that you're laying out, your latest linguistics paper perhaps, then you can basically organize it in a thought web and say, okay, this is my main point. These are points that support it. These are data that support those, like specific bits of data. This is where I found that part of data. I'm attributing that to a source, etc. And these needn't be verbs. They're really just conceptual connections that tie two concepts together. And you can do the basic ones like that in a more grammaticalized way. Another one that you can do is meta stuff. Like, for example, John talked a bit about metaphor and frame binding. I don't think you actually talked about role binding that, but you can have basically that, if you guys know what I'm talking about. Role binding and frames, you've got your buyer and your bartering item, and et cetera, et cetera. You can just bind them to it, and that's it. And you can say, you know, this talk grew, and I use the symbol for a tree growing. And instead of this tree grew, where I attach tree to the grow where it would go, I just attach talk to it, and I mark that connection as being somehow metaphorical, or not. If you can obviously just leave it implied pragmatically, like we do in most languages, but you can if you want. And for that matter, all the things that I've talked about distinguishing, you don't have to distinguish. English doesn't. Is, right? The verb to be in English is horribly overloaded if you think about it. I am a teacher. What does that mean? There's a few different things I can say, like, I am a teacher by nature. I like teaching people. I do that. I am a teacher by profession. I am a member of a set of teachers. You could try to say that as an equation, but that would be a little bit weird. I don't know of languages that use the same word for, say, attribution and possession copulas, but there might be. Maybe some of you guys can think of one. So yeah, I mean, in any particular nonlinear language, you don't necessarily need to distinguish elements, but you could. And that's the only point. The second way I can think of this working, which is much harder to conceive of, and frankly, it's hard for me to really wrap my mind around it. I've got sort of a concept of what it would be like, but it's hard to really picture it, is something I would call massively fusional. So we know fusion in regular morphology, right? You've got some word and some morpheme, and they bind together and you can't really tell them apart, right? So a simple drawing I can do, again, this is really kludgy, so pardon my art, or lack thereof, is suppose that's one symbol, and suppose that's another symbol, right? So what if we just do that? There you go, fused symbol. You can't really say, well, this is one symbol and this is another. Yeah, not really. So this is fusion, basically. And then the thing is, this is just two very, very simple symbols. What if you had, instead of that, all of your symbols fusing together like that, and it looks like basically one very large, very interconnected, very complicated ideogram. So like Kanji or Hanzi or whatever preferred ideographic languages, or not strictly ideographic. Let's kludge that. And it looked like sort of a massive spaghetti, possibly. Maybe if you're more artistic than me, it'll look nicer. And in that sense, you wouldn't really be able to tell where one idea starts and where another ends. Yes?
Doesn't that raise a potential problem, though, in terms of certain learnability, in that if I make my fusional elements nevertheless discernible, more agglutinative than fusional, there's fewer symbols ultimately I have to learn. And even though they can occupy the same space, well, you know, do I have to learn symbol A and then symbol B and then a separate third symbol,
Which is the fusion, yeah, okay.
or can I just know A and B and be able
Yeah.
to recognize essentially an overlapping
Yeah, that,
A plus B?
that's,
Yeah, parsable.
yeah, that latter is my conception of it. But of course, one of the things that you can think of pretty quickly is, like all languages, these are going to get regularized to a certain extent. And something that started off as a fusion is just going to turn into a thing in its own right. And maybe that gets simplified further, and you can get like some derivational structure there over time. And you no longer are really analyzing it in its
Well,
fusion.
what's driving my question is that the level of complexity you're talking about here, it seems to me, is going to demand a lot of different kinds of symbology. And if you start making fusional elements that become their own symbols, then you just add a whole other layer of symbols you got learned. You're still learning thousands.
Yeah, no, I
millions of symbols.
I wasn't necessarily talking about fusional ones being their own symbols in their A plus B sense. I was just saying you can fuse them for a particular purpose. Like, for example, suppose you have a symbol for man, and a symbol for live, and a symbol for Oakland. Or you probably won't have Oakland, but you know, hot, whatever. Rug, box, wherever you happen to live. I don't know how much you guys are getting excited these days. But suppose you fused all those together in, wow, some particular way. Yeah, I think that was me. Suppose you fuse those together in some way, and you can basically say that the verb has particular ways that it takes to fusing things, like this stick of it is the fusing point, or that you can say that different nouns are in different classes and they have some sort of regular shapes, and therefore you can say this type of noun class will bind to this sort of area, this sort of noun class will fuse with this sort of area, and you can have that sort of thing, where you're not necessarily learning the fused symbol as it's still a bunch of symbols. They're just not this and this, but they actually work with each other.
Just a comment, reminding me of enzymes. You can have like a verb as an enzyme with particular active spots.
Yes.
You know, that would.
That's definitely one of the inspirations. Actually, I've been taking a little bit of neuroscience and molecular and cell biology and things like that lately. And yeah, that's very much one idea of it. I don't know whether the rest of you guys know what enzymes are like. You basically have this weird protein that facilitates a chemical reaction and things bind and it does weird stuff. I'm simplifying just a little bit. There's MCB whatever for you.
Hopefully this will operate at the same millions of times a second speeds.
Oh yeah, that would be nice. But there are obviously other ways you would have syntax. Like for example, suppose you had a node and connection paradigm, which is a lot simpler to think about. You could have, say, let's say we've got a verb again. This thing's dirty, and I don't have a eraser. Oh well. What? Hell no. You sure?
Yes.
Okay. So, suppose you have a symbol that is asymmetrical. So like do, I just made that up totally randomly. And let's say this is a verb and it points, let's say this is give, right? Let's say you've got, I'll use a little bit of English here. Box, linguist. Because linguists always need boxes. I'm feeling random. Let's say this just points in the direction of its giving this. And if I just rotate this, so it's do, and still do that, you just get a different syntax. And that's one way you can do syntax with nodes, and that's been suggested by other people, and in fact used in a couple other systems that I've seen. Another way you could do it is to have the symbols, since you are dealing with a visual medium, and this really has never been done before that I can tell, except for maybe ideographs in a really small way. Not sure. You could, what was I saying?
Visual medium.
Visual medium, thank you. You could have your basic images, like the con John was talking about earlier, where you've got container schema and basic schemas. You could have them visually represented. Like you could have a container schema thing, or contain the verb, be literally contain X, right? Y contains X. That's uber simple, really. And I would hope that no one creates something quite that kludgy. But I mean, hopefully you get the idea. The point is that in normal written languages, the symbols themselves, as their graphemes, have no meaning. You can say that pictographs have meaning, and in that sense, it's very similar to that. But this would be a little bit more abstracted than that. So you still have an abstracted thing. It's not just a little man or whatever. But they have semantic roles or syntactical roles that are depicted in their visual structure. Their literal visual structure as you draw them, that you can interact with. And that's what I would call accessibility within a symbol. So suppose you have a verb, you could have points where you bind particular nouns, points where you bind roles, etc., that are in some way visually symbolic, but not necessarily look like what they're symbolizing. Just they look like the idea, as it were. I know that's a little bit vague, but hopefully you get the idea. So I already mentioned the zooming idea. A related thing is that you can have basically chunking limits of, your standard cog-psych 7 plus or minus 2 is what you can perceive simultaneously, or you can hold in your mind simultaneously. So you could just say that's a constraint. At any level of zoom, you only have 7 plus or minus 2 symbols. Or so, or not. And then, hypothetically, this would make the system very glanceable, so that instead of trying to read a page at a time, you just see some level of zoom of symbols. You see that structure, and you can perceive it pretty quickly. And then you look more carefully at some subset, and you've got that. So, yes?
I'm trying to visualize an analogy for trying to understand what you're talking about, and what's coming to me, and I want to run this by you to see if I'm understanding.
Please.
I'm thinking of like, I need to give a group of people directions to this conference, right? And I can do it in two ways. I can do it by writing out narrative in linear language, in which case I'm going to give Chris a set of instructions that begins get on I-80 with this, this there, and then the one I'm going to give someone else, rearranges the order of those because they're coming from a different place and has sentences in it that aren't in Chris's because they need different accents, etc. Or I can give every one a single roadmap.
Exactly.
Whatever. Or let's call it a Yahoo or MapQuest site that they can zoom in on, zoom out of. And then I give one non-linear three-dimensional thing or two-dimensional thing, the same one to everyone, who then focuses on that part of it that they need, zooms in where necessary, and the symbols on my map, I can get fancy and show the roads, maybe color schemas or color variations.
Yes, exactly.
Kinds of relationships as to what kind of cars are allowed on what road. Or
and I would say that a map is a form of what I'm talking about. It's a very, very simple form. It only shows actual physical relationships between places. You've got this is here, you've got this thing that says this is that way, that far. Okay, it's pretty straightforward. But yeah, it's very like a map in that you can have a map of ideas. And in that way, I think one thing that this sort of language would be optimal for is presenting a network of ideas, where you're trying to describe your latest theory, or you're trying to anything, whatever, some theory you have. You're trying to describe a psychological setup that you have, where you can describe it in physical terms. Like it can say, well, standing up here reminds me of that time in kindergarten where someone threw a tomato at me. This didn't really happen. And this brings up this emotional connotation, and etc. And this is basically really just an association map in your head of emotions. This thing is linked to this thing, this is linked to this event, which is linked to this emotion, and therefore you get this thing, it's linked to that emotion. Whereas if you try to describe it, it's not necessarily that clear. And for something like that, it would be pretty good. One thing I need to point out that I think makes it a little bit difficult for some people to get it, as it were, is that my experience of thought and what the actual conscious process of thought, what is it like to think? And from what I've talked to a few different people about this, when they get the question, it's a sort of a weird question, is that we perceive our thought in very different ways. The way I perceive mine is, for the most part, unless I'm rehearsing a conversation or I'm thinking of what I'm going to say, or, this is the one exception, if I'm trying to memorize something or write something down or symbolize it in a way, because I only have that linear textual language to do that in. But if I'm normally just thinking about something, it's a much more abstract thing. It's a sort of cascading network of ideas. This leads to this. I've got several things going on simultaneously. It's not just, as is more traditionally conceptualized, you've got this one thought that goes to this other thought, and you've got this basically a running monologue of thought.
Full sentences.
Yeah, though I do know people who think like that. And for you guys, speech is probably going to be working out better. That's perfectly fine by me. Sorry. Good luck on this other language. And I know people who think in text, like literally text. Read a lot of books when I was a kid. And some people who think in sort of emotional things and etc. I think the idea that we all perceive our own conscious process the same is not true. And this one is obviously very much biased towards mine and towards trying to express the way I think in a more symbolic way. So I can try to map out my thought process and say, not it's this little prick of light traveling a network, but more like it's a spotlight that highlights whole regions at a time. Or possibly a couple spotlights, where you've got them diverging, and I can follow different things simultaneously, and sometimes they converge, sometimes I'm only focused on one thing. But I have multiple thoughts going on in my head simultaneously, and they sort of intersect, and etc. And that's what I'm trying to express here. You seem really... Okay, yeah.
Well, down at the maximum level of Zoom, where you have
Maximum outer
in,
yeah.
where you're looking at the lowest level kind of components of the stage, you have things that are representing what we would call words.
Quite probably.
But as you come back out, you have to then have a knowledge of some other kind of meta symbols that give you a rough idea of what you're going to see.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Go in.
That gets back to your earlier question. So yeah, there's basically two ways you can think of that. If you've got this sort of a well-implemented zoom system, you can either have the zoomed out version. So let's take that thing I drew earlier, which was like I'm probably doing it wrong, something like that. Whatever. I think that's what it was. Whatever. It doesn't really matter. So you've got that structure. And then suppose you also happen to have a symbol that looks like that, or some better approximation. And yeah, if you zoom out, then it's just going to sort of fuse together like that when you've got the symbol. And that symbol could either be, say, Hamlet. Like this is the symbol for Hamlet, and then you zoom in on him and it's got his biography. Or it could be a meta symbol that sort of somehow expresses how these ideas are joined together.
Or maybe just the most critical or important of the lower levels.
Exactly, exactly. And then you could say maybe the zoomed out structure is the head of that phrase. If you have some sort of equivalent to that, it's obviously not going to be the end of the phrase, but I'm sure you can think of it being sort of analogous. I have a few other things that I could talk about that elaborate on different points. I think what I want before I ask for general questions is to point out what I think the usefulness of this would be. So, first and foremost, just to screw with you. And I mean that in the best way possible. To screw with me, really. Because I like trying to think of something that I find it difficult to think about. Because I always get the feeling when I have that it will teach me something new, that it will teach me a different way to think. And that seems inherently valuable to me. Another is, of course, you get a new art form. You've got a whole new field of poetry. You've got a completely different kind of poetry that you can do. And I think that's inherently valuable. Like I said, it's better for expressing certain kinds of ideas, for expressing theories, for expressing emotions, for maybe expressing some kinds of stories of some very different kind. Possibly unrecognizable, but that's okay. Hamlet probably would not work very well in this because, you know, you need that setup, resolution, boy meets girl, or however you like it. That's Romeo. Boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy kills self. That's a lot of Shakespeare stories, actually.
You're about one step away from Darmok at this point.
I'll refrain from taking the extra one. It's, of course, it's a thought experiment. It brings up some interesting ideas because to use this system well, you have to think very differently. Or not, maybe not. And whether you do or not would be an important distinction to look into. So you'd want to say, for example, how would it affect people who subverbalize their thought, who think in an a voice talking all the time? I know people who have that. You just have a voice commenting on everything you're hearing that is your thought process. How would it affect people like that if they learned this? Could they? Would it if you have symbols that don't have an inherent up direction, like N, you only write like this, or well, it's symmetrical. You know what I mean? A, you only write like that. So what if your symbol is non-symmetrical, but it doesn't have a canonical orientation? There's a pretty well-known thing in cognitive psychology where you take people and you show them letters, and you ask them to identify or you show them numbers or something, I forget what it is, and you ask them to identify what kind of thing it is, like if it's even number or odd number or something like that. Or I think they use shapes, whether it was facing one way or another. And the result is that their response latency is directly correlated to the degrees it's rotated from the canonical. Directly, like linear line. Would someone who's used to this, if you expose them to symbols in this language, where they're not necessarily always oriented the same way, would they have a different response on that test using these symbols? If so, you get a pretty interesting result for cognitive psychology in terms of pattern recognition, template theory, etc., all that stuff I'm not going to go into. But if you know what I mean, you probably know. Where was I? A similar thing I'll only briefly mention is if you're a Chomskyist and you've got an idea of an embedded linear syntax, this might pose some interesting questions. I already mentioned the moving spotlight theory of consciousness that this really gets into. So I really think there are some serious research potentials in it that you can run experiments on if you really want to. I can think of some military applicabilities, possibly if it's a better display method, if you really perceive it more quickly or more intuitively or something. Obviously that's very universally applicable. That's not proven. That's just pure conjecture, whether it would be or not.
Wouldn't that be a good
Yes.
for a new form of poetry, it seems to be, because you have meta levels of
Yes, yes, exactly.
There'd be an image level of the poem,
Exactly.
an emotional level of the poem, and then a literal level of the poem.
Exactly, and for that matter, you could have something, the equivalent of a koan, where you're not capable of zooming out far enough to see it, and you can only pan around, or you can only hypertext it, and you have to realize what the overall structure is. And possibly only your interaction with this is through a spotlight effect, and you can and do that, and you then realize what the overall structure is, and that has something to it. It would be an interesting thing to try. I think that really covers most of it. I'll say basically two more things. For future possibilities, one, you can make this even more complicated and make it user responsive. You can get an eye tracker, detects where you're looking at this thing, and somehow the system changes in response, either by simply panning and zooming. If you focus on something, it zooms, and if you defocus it, dezooms. You can do that pretty easily. But maybe the network changes while you're looking here. This thing changes over here. It would be an interesting interactive story to do that. And the other thing is, of course, you could do this in 3 dimensions, like a holograph or something. But that would be pretty complicated. So I'm not going to really comment on the particular systems that I've seen that do this, because I actually made a rule for this conference that we're not to critique other languages. And for that matter, I don't want to say that I really have that much criticism, as in negative things to say. But I'd like to point out just a few languages that have tried similar related things that you might want to take a look at. One is called Glyphica Arcana, Glyphica Arcana, which is a sort of a two-dimensional grid thing. Another is John Quijada's system with the cartouches. Yeah, you can see an example of it, although I think it's not a very complicated example. I've seen much more interesting
ones. It doesn't really
ones.
matter what you're talking about. It's because it's still quasi-linear, that there's a starting point.
Yeah.
And it's sequentially read.
But
it's a
it is
two-dimensional way
similar.
of presenting what
Yeah.
is usually represented in one dimension.
I just wanted to mention that because it is similar. There's Uyaru, however you pronounce that, which is very similar to what I'm talking about. It differs on a few things, but I think it's really pretty close. There's a language called Heptapod B, which is just described in a story by Ted Chiang called Story of Your Life. Read it if you haven't. Heptapodb.org, I believe, has a copy of it that I probably bet they didn't ask for copyright. Reprint permissions on that. But it's a cool story, and it just sketches the idea. And basically, if it's in Heptapod B, I'm for it. Just because it really does get at what I'm trying to describe. There's also a language called Pinuyo, which was developed on Conlang a few years ago. Pinuyo. And I think it also uses a sort of cartouche-based one, but I'm not going to really comment on it further. There may be others, but I don't know. So, how many minutes do we have left on that?
1 minute, 40 seconds.
Okay. So let's see. Replace it when you get to it, but we'll continue into the next talk right after me. Does anyone have any questions that they haven't already asked? Yes, please.
It's not a question, it's just
Or comment or whatever.
I was wondering whether you had heard of the Russian movement. It was a poetic, artistic movement called Zaum.
No.
It's
Zaum?
Z-A-U-M, I'm not pronouncing it.
Zaum. What the hell does that mean? Other Russian speakers in the room.
I don't know.
Yeah, what's Zaum?
I think it might have been, it's sort of a nonsense
Is it
word.
a nonsense word?
I think it's a nonsense
It-
word, but the idea was to use language in ways that were pictorial. It's probably not fitting your map very well, but you would combine images, words, pictures, you would try to disrupt the whole concept of linear thinking.
Well, I hadn't heard of it before, but I've made a note for myself, so I'll look it up.
Nonsense like poetry used by Russian poets.
Gulevnikov?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Thank you for the reference. I'll take a look. Yes?
Again, my comment is just the only language that is remotely nonlinear in human existence is probably Inca. And Inca doesn't have the written language. What they have is the people, which is tied string of knots. And it's string on string on string, so it's more like a branching type of thing. And there's a conjecture that it's actually a language with certain number of phonics.
It's a method of memorizing something.
Yeah,
Yeah, I'm totally not familiar with that.
yeah, you probably should look at.
Do you know what the particular language is called? Inca what?
Yeah, it's a T4K H5.
QUIPU, and it's
QUIPPU?
basically a
Okay.
method for one messenger to listen to somebody, and every
Yeah.
dot on the thing represents a taxonomy. And
Yeah.
then he goes and he recites it word for word
Right.
to the other, to
Right.
the recipient.
Oh,
of the
yeah, for that
message.
matter, you could have like this be written by two people at once. You could have like interconnecting stories, like red for one person and blue for another, and they somehow interconnect. You could have this be an online thing where you use it like an IM chat, except you're drawing lines. Yeah.
I'm trying to remember the name of the novel by Alfred Bester about
Bester?
about people with a gift of telepathy, who basically had a custom when they were conversing all together. The custom was to sort of weave their thoughts in some sort of a matrix or
What's the problem?
pattern.
Pattern?
Yeah, I don't remember the name of the. Anybody?
Okay. Well, then, unless anyone has further questions, I think we'll go on to the next speaker then.